tricky, but more of the same, really.
You're there. And I think you're in the middle, Damien. Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Odeon Theatre. The session this morning is called Death Spiral. Are the mainstream media, the MSM, really in a death spiral? Have they shirked their duty as the fourth estate? On stage this morning with me is Damien Cave from the New York Times. He's the bureau chief in Sydney. His previous posting as a correspondent has taken him to Mexico, Central America, Haiti, Cuba, Miami, and Baghdad. Also, Claire, I only have your first name on the Claire Lehmann, that's correct, is an Australian writer and founder and editor of Colette magazine. She's considered to be one of the leading figures of the international intellectual dark web, as it's described. And Julian Morrow has made a career, he says, out of being a public nuisance in the form of being co-founder of satirical media empire The Chaser and joke company Giant Dwarf. You'll also know him from shows including CNN, The Hamster Wheel and The Checkout. Would you please put your hands together for Damien, Claire and Julian. Claire, if I can start with you.
Sure.
If there has been a failure of the media, if it is in a death spiral, did it fail during the federal election in Australia particularly?
I think there was a failure to cover issues that were not important to people living in inner cities. So I think one of the real problems that media struggles with is the bubble effect. So you've got people living in urban centres, they're of a similar social class, they're of a similar education level, similar socioeconomic status, and they care about and cover issues important to them. And so you'll see that in Australia with the coverage on things like climate change, identity issues, so on and so forth, these issues are just not as salient to people living in rural areas. And I think breaking out of that bubble is a real challenge, and even institutions like the ABC are not terribly good at it. So solving that problem is a challenge, and I do think that when you get these instances where people are absolutely blindsided because all of these people in a country have voted a different way than what they were expecting, that's a failure of media to be covering issues that are important to everybody.
And so is that something that has evolved and is new in a sense, or has that always been the case? We're just slightly more aware of it today?
I think with the advent of certain technologies and with maths education, you're seeing people clustering into communities more and more, perhaps more than what they were doing generations ago. So lots of young people who grow up in rural environments move to the cities for their education and they stay in the cities. And so that can mean that there's a bigger gap between urban and rural than there was potentially a couple of generations ago.
So, Julian, do you think that's a fair criticism that, for example, the ABC failed to cover regional Australia in the same way that it did metropolitan Australia, and therefore you get a sort of distorted expectation of what the outcome might be in the instance of a federal election?
Well, honestly, not really. I mean, I think there's a bit of an irony, particularly focusing on the lack of regional coverage with the ABC. I think one of the reasons that the ABC remains a much and widely loved institution in Australia is because of its regional coverage and its commitment to regional media as well, having regional outlets. I mean, I think that there is always a tension between covering niche issues and, well, not niche issues, but issues that are of particular concern to elites and issues and bread and butter issues. But I think it really twas ever thus, and my feeling is that actually there is a better breadth of coverage now and more sort of permeation between those two things, largely because of technology. So despite the fact that I've devoted, 20 years to criticising things and being pessimistic and trying to tear things down. I'm not as pessimistic as our very, very pessimistic topic suggests.
So, Damien, how then do you explain, and obviously this is not unique to Australia, but how do you explain the fact that, by and large, the Australian media led the public to believe that it was going to be a wipeout pretty much for the coalition at the federal election, that there would almost certainly be a Labor government, and yet got it so wrong?
Well, I mean, it does remind me a little bit of what happened in the United States in terms of coverage. And I think one of the things that's really important to note is that even if there is lots of coverage of those communities, it's also about promoting that coverage, making sure that coverage gets read by the cities, by the other people. And so technology has made that a lot harder. And so even if there is great coverage coming out of regional areas, it doesn't mean that anyone in Melbourne or Sydney is actually going to see it.
So why, if you were running a newspaper or a news organisation, why would you, and the majority of your audience in a particular state was in the biggest city in that state, why would you start weighting the coverage towards communities that sit outside of the majority of your audience?
I think there's a way to do it that allows you to speak to both audiences. I think often regional or rural coverage is assumed to be these smaller issues as opposed to being written about, connection to the land is a story that, is important in cities and in regional areas. And if you frame it in a way that actually makes people in both places give a shit, then it can work. I think the New York Times,
give me an example.
So, for example, thinking of the American election, I was in the US as an editor on the national desk before the Trump election, and we did a whole bunch of stories about anxious America, about people in these places that were feeling a great degree of anxiety about technology, about globalization. Those stories were good stories. They didn't get as much attention on our homepage as that ticker that said that Hillary Clinton was going to win. That was a flaw in the system for us. And so that's what I think of a lot in Australia too, as I look at the coverage and I say, well, are the media companies doing enough, not just to cover these areas for them, but also to find a way to make connection points? If we live in a more divided society, then the media has a responsibility not just to inform, but to connect and to make people understand people beyond their comfort zone.
Claire, do you think that there's also something here about the way we consume media and also what we expect from it? I mean, to take the example you've just pointed to and the sort of failure to cover regional issues, I mean, I work on the ABC a lot, and you will often get criticism for not covering a particular story from listeners or viewers. They will text you, they will tweet you, often within the same program that you have in fact covered that story, saying, why didn't you do it?
Yeah, so this has a lot to do with technology. So before the internet existed, media companies had a monopoly on distribution. So if you imagine you're hungry and you want to go out for dinner and you've got a street and there's one restaurant to choose from. So you go into that restaurant and there's different cuisines, but you're exposed to all of the different cuisines. Now, post-internet, there is no monopoly on distribution. It's completely democratized, and you've got an extremely busy restaurant strip with 30, 40, 100 different restaurants to choose from. And you go into your restaurant that you like with the cuisine that you like, and you have no idea what's been served up at the other end of that strip. And this is just a result of the internet and everybody being able to enter into the media market and give people what they want. And because of our confirmation biases, we just consume the content that we like, and unfortunately it means that we become quite closed off from what other people are consuming.
Does it mean, though, that the media is failing? If we're closed off to the other things that the media are doing and not willing to listen to that, does that actually mean the media is failing?
I mean, I agree with Damien that we have a moral duty to help people connect and help people understand and be exposed to different points of view. But at some point, we also have to accept that the old world is gone, and we don't have the New York Times doesn't have a monopoly on distribution, the ABC doesn't have a monopoly on distribution, and we're living in an era where media companies have to be competitive to survive, and they're going to target niche audiences.
And that's what you do.
Yes.
How do you identify areas or topics that you think are not being covered by the rest of the media and also find an audience for them?
Well, we've been very successful in publishing long-form articles on meaty substantive topics, sometimes on topics that are too taboo and controversial for other organisations to go near. And that's been successful for us because we've found that there's a huge appetite for high-quality intellectual conversation. But what we've done is we've targeted this niche globally. So it's not just a niche within Australia, it's not just within the US or Canada or the UK. We target this small group of people who want high quality intellectual conversation, but all over the world. So that means we have quite a large audience, but they're just spread out.
So what's something that's too controversial for the rest of the media to touch?
Well, one example was when James Damore was sacked from Google. We were the first publication to survey a group of scientists who had expertise in sex differences and gender preferences in occupation. Because I have an academic network, I contacted these scientists and asked them to comment on his memo, and we published that. And I noticed that we were the only publication in the world who actually looked at the science rather than just an interpretation of what people thought his memo was saying. Mm-hmm. And so that hit a nerve. That was very popular because, you know, there are only so many op-eds and interpretations people want to read before they want to read some expertise on a particularly controversial and sensitive topic.
Damien, do you think that that in itself is too controversial for other media to cover?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think some of what Claire does and what Colette does is take an academic perspective that also, I would argue, has a point of view. And so, you know, I think it just depends on, you know, there's a comfort with a point of view that may not be popular, that may be more conservative in a world like technology that's very liberal and on the left. So that serves a purpose. And I think that sort of agenda-driven, more ideological point of view isn't something that the ABC or the New York Times feels is comfortable deeply exploring. Now, I think a lot of what Claire does should and does have a home at places like the New York Times in the opinion section. But I do think that these things are not taboo, but there's always a need for more voices and fresh eyes to look at things. And I think that that's a benefit to everybody, no matter what position people come from.
Well, I was just going to add, I find myself feeling that there's a lot of conversational time spent talking about issues that we don't talk about, which suggests to me that we are actually talking about them all the time,
right.
Incessantly. I think that what the problems that we're actually facing probably have more to do with the negative effects of the good part of what Claire's found, which is that you can aggregate niches all around the world, and that's good for those sort of connections to be made. But there is a tendency for there to be like hard edges that develop on that, and that means that the centre is not holding as well. And it does seem that media is getting more tribal, although if you look back over the years, it's always been accused of being pretty tribal. So I think it's as much driven by the business models as the individual media practitioners, but it just does feel that culturally we're at a moment where the centre's just not holding.
Yeah, I mean, and I wondered though, is it the media companies or is it readers and audiences too? Like they're responding to the fact that our societies are more divided, and that's what people want. And
well, it's easier for media to influence the broader population when you've got a fuck ton of advertising money from classifieds to be able to employ more journalists and have more influence. I think it's become harder for those cultural institutions to have that influence. But I don't really. I think that's a problem that we need to work through more than a death spiral.
Claire, how would you respond to what Damien said about where your journalism might sit in a publication like the New York Times? It's not necessarily too controversial, that it's just more opinion than it is news as such.
I think maybe 80 or 90% of what we publish would probably fit that, but we certainly do publish things that you would never see in a mainstream publication.
That's probably true. I mean, do you ever have concerns? I mean, to his point, that if the center is valuable,
Yes.
do you ever worry that you're pushing people away from a center, that you're contributing to this sort of outrage culture, but from a different perspective?
No, I don't, because everything we publish has a calm tone to it. We don't publish anything that's angry or bitter. We don't publish screeds. I would argue that the New York Times, in some instances, has published some pretty egregious, angry op-eds, such as, "Can my children be friends with white people?" Mm-hmm. I remember that op-ed. And then there is the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post published "Why Can't I Hate Men?" by a gender studies professor. And that was the title. And then the article was about, why isn't she allowed to be an open misandrist? You know, men have done all of these bad things. Why is it not okay to hate men? At Quillette, we are liberal, centrist humanists, and we completely reject any kind of sentiment which makes it okay to hate large groups of people. So I would argue that we bring people back to the centre, and that some publications, even if they are prestigious, are potentially pulling people away from it.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, it's just the question is, do we all agree that the center, returning to the center, is valuable or not?
Absolutely.
You know, and that's I don't know that the public agrees with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I would hazard a guess, Claire, that you don't want to become mainstream media at that sort of scale, and that's because you've made an editorial decision to produce a certain type of work, and that's great, and it probably does have a beneficial effect on the central argument, because you're developing new writers who can, you know, speak in the media more broadly. I must say, over the years, I've come to the view that it's actually harder to speak well to the centre and to a mass audience than it is to serve a niche. And I think, in particular, about a former colleague of mine and a colleague of yours, Hamish, Waleed Ali. Waleed is one of the great talents of Australian media, and he has gone from, he always maintains his academic email address, if nothing else, but, you know, being a columnist in The Age, which he still does, and a Radio National broadcaster. But I think actually bringing the sort of level of the quality of discussion that he brings to a Channel 10 audience on the project is a far harder task than the task of doing a Radio National show, even though, you know, Radio National is not something that anyone can do. And I think, so I've got a great respect for people who try to work that centre ground, which is not to say that everyone who's not doing it is, you know, somehow failing society and causing the death of the media.
But there's a lot of people that in fact write in the newspapers saying that Waleed is not the centre, that actually he's on a sort of fringe.
Well, I think it's pretty hard to argue that Waleed Ali is not mainstream these days.
So what's the difference between mainstream and the centre?
Well, I mean, mainstream, I think, refers to volume. Most people are aware of it, and centre is a political alignment. Waleed's left of centre, I would say, but also in terms of his religious beliefs, they don't really align with what you think of as the inner city lefty. And that's good, that's great. I think that the centre is actually a lot broader and actually a lot more tolerant at its best than we sometimes give it credit for, but also the centre can be a nasty place as well. And so there's just this constant tension.
Claire, do you think that what we're talking about here is the media doing something that reflects broader society, in that there seems to be a realignment, or at least a fight at this point in time about where the centre is?
Potentially, and that's actually a conversation we've been having at Quillette, and where because so many of our audience identify as centrist, but they used to identify as being on the left.
Yeah.
And so we've observed a massive shift where people feel like they maybe 5 or 10 years ago they were leftists, and now they don't feel that way anymore, and they're shifting further to the right.
I think there is a sort of quiet alienation from, I think, and maybe the idea of leftist orthodoxy has become more prominent. But yeah, that rings true to me.
Yeah, and I think it probably happens in the other direction as well.
Totally.
Yeah.
But we cater to an audience where it's that shift.
So, Damien, if there is a failure of the media right now, is it in failing to understand that there may be a realignment going on in society more broadly, whereby people no longer see themselves as fitting into these more traditional binaries and left and right? There's been a lot of discussion post this federal election about people in notionally conservative seats that believe in climate change, and people in sort of working class areas that are now tending more towards the right of politics, and that actually the media has been so sort of stuck in its ways that it's failed to recognise that broader realignment.
Well, I think it's probably failed to recognize this broader realignment, and I think the media often fails to do a good job with nuance and complication. Like, I think one of the great challenges, and this is in part because technology makes the voices on the extremes so loud, that it's very hard, even if you're a mainstream media outlet, not to pay close attention to those extremes. And so I think there's probably too much coverage of, crazy left orthodoxy and crazy right-wingism too. I think that the reality is there's a lot of people whose views and political beliefs don't fit so easily into this box. And I think what you're seeing is the boxes are becoming more problematic for everyone. And I don't think we've done a very good job of explaining that to people.
So if the media is in a death spiral, I think a lot of people have observed the AFP raids this week on a News Limited journalist and on the ABC as being very clear evidence of that. What's your take on what's happened this week, Dan?
I've been pretty outspoken for a while about Australia's culture of secrecy and its lack of transparency. And so to me, this is just the latest example of this trend in a way that's like pretty obvious and stark, in a way that it hasn't necessarily been before. And I do think, the question is, does the public care in the same way that the journalistic tribe does? This is an important thing for journalism. I think we believe in this idea of having people have the right to be whistleblowers, of not having a bunch of police show up in a newsroom and spend 8 hours downloading documents. That's what happens in authoritarian states. I've seen it.
Why is it so shocking to you to see that happen in Australia? Just break that down in a very simple way.
I think, to me, and having worked in other countries where there is autocracy, the government and the state wants to have so much power over information and control over information, and it reminds me very much of that, and that gives me pause. And I think it's of great concern when things are deemed secret, and that alone is enough to justify a raid, as opposed to, is this for the public good? Is this the public interest? You saw the AFP, and you see Morrison and others saying, this is just about the law. Well, the law does not take into account the fact that these are stories that are important for the public to know, that are simply embarrassing to this government. And so they're trying to limit the conversation, limit the amount of information, and I see this throughout Australian society, whether it's public access to information, whether it's a lack of independent data, whether it's defamation law, like secrecy is rife throughout the whole country.
I think the architecture of defence of free speech and the free press in Australia is clearly not as good as in America. Some of those differences are differences of scale.
Right.
But yeah, it's certainly, it's interesting to try and get your head in the minds of the federal police of why they thought that was the best way to go about getting that information and why now.
But you're in a country where there's been more than 60 laws that have been either created or amended since 9/11 in Australia about national security. No other country in the world has passed that many laws. So this is an international anomaly.
It's not like the George W. Bush government didn't massively increase national security powers in America.
Right.
These trends, I think, are broadly happening across liberal democracies. But I also think you're right that Australia is just not very good at institutional defence against that. The counterweight is not as strong here.
Right. But does the public actually care, though, about this stuff, Julian? I noticed this week Matt Bevan on Radio National tweeting saying that there was a lot of Radio National listeners texting the text line saying the ABC got what it deserved.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that's I think the public doesn't care that much, and that's but that's
why is that?
Well, because they're probably more concerned about the bread and butter issues of wages than whether the ABC's been raided. But that doesn't mean that it's not important. And I also think that what we mean by don't care is we mean it's like not a source of such great outrage today that they're going to turn up to the ABC in protest. But I think at some level most people do still want a society where the press is free and where power is held to account, and people understand that the media broadly is part of doing that.
I wonder too if it's just like a lack of crisis. I mean, I think in the United States, nobody gave a shit about the media, frankly, until Trump won. And now, the failing New York Times is not failing, in part because there's a return to respect and admiration and need for good journalism. And, Australia has been lucky enough to go through many, many years without a major crisis. And I think, many Australians will tell me, yeah, you know what, we've become complacent. And so I think, how do you stir a country out of that? And I think this is across many democracies. American democracy is complacent in all kinds of ways too, and the British too. So how do you reinvigorate democracy? The media has to play a role in that, but you also need the public to come on board with you.
Can I jump in on that? I think the New York Times and that phrase, the failing New York Times, is quite interesting. My sense is that what's happening is I think the media is copying its phase of the general decline in trust in institutions generally.
Right. Trust
in religion is low. Trust in media as institutions has eroded. And I think generally that trust has been devolving down into individuals. I don't read the Sydney Morning Herald now like I used to, largely because most of the journalists who I actually trusted in there are now with other publications. I trust Lenore Taylor more than I trust the Sydney Morning Herald masthead. I think The Guardian and the New York Times have and probably the BBC and the ABC stand as the institutions which have copped that trend the least, because there really is still trust in those institutions. But I'm also worried that we're getting to a point where, and it happens in comedy as well, there's a difference between skepticism and cynicism.
Yeah.
And
sure.
I think that sometimes we just get to the point, and Trump stands for this, where he just goes, well, they're all shit. They're just all shit all the time. And we all know that means because he's not even thinking about it. But it does seem that sentiment, like a cynical sentiment about the media, is proliferating.
I think some of that lack of trust is warranted.
Yeah,
and
totally.
It's partly because of the business model, and if you look at how clickbait, how dependence on advertising revenue from clicks incentivise certain types of content, so content that actually causes outrage. Mm-hmm. I mean, publications would receive revenue depending on whether someone was sharing an article because they were outraged by it or sharing it because they liked it and wanted to promote the content. So the clickbait, the digital advertising has incentivized a whole lot of rubbish content that's caused outrage, that's made trust in some of these institutions decline. And then the other thing I would say is that I think I've observed slightly more advocacy amongst journalists, and you'll see it both on the right and the left, but there is sometimes a blurred line between journalism and activism.
Yeah,
and the more that happens, the less likely media institutions are going to be trusted, because you don't know whether you're reading something that's neutral and fact-based or whether it's slanted.
Well, I also think the problem with that kind of agenda-driven journalism is that you end up with blind spots. You don't look for the information that doesn't fit your point of view already, and then the public that you're serving doesn't get that information. And so I think everyone who's in journalism has to, individually and as an institution, sort of compete against that, fight that urge.
And you'll get the best way to counter that is by having newsrooms and organisations with viewpoint diversity. So having conservatives, progressives, centrists, everybody checking each other's blind spots all of the time. And that's one of the problems when you get middle-class kids going through universities and going to these elite colleges, particularly in America. They all come from the same kind of background. They all get the same education, and they're going into a place like the New York Times. They all think the same. how can they check each other's blind spots?
No, I think that's really important. I think intellectual diversity, I think diversity of background, and but it's interesting because this is a conversation a bit about identity. And, in the United States, there's an argument that there's too much conversation about identity. But in newsrooms, I think we've been way behind. I have many Trump voters in my family. When I had that conversation with the New York Times around the election time, they were shocked, half the people that in my colleagues told, in that world. People who come from backgrounds that aren't elite, it's very rare in journalism, it's too rare, frankly.
Do you think that that's a similar problem in Australia, or is there more diversity just because our education system is so different to the United States?
It's hard for me to comment on Australia because I've not worked in any newsrooms in Australia, but I imagine it's fairly similar.
I think it's very, I don't know, I'm curious what you think, Julian. I think it's pretty similar.
Well, I haven't worked in newsrooms either. When you were saying that, though, I think that there's an important distinction to be drawn between viewpoint diversity, which I think is important, and probably the backgrounds of people. I don't think that there's any great advances to be made by focusing on the concept of balance, because I think that well, certainly in my area, which isn't news, has been satire. I think that sort of the idea of trying to have balance is just becomes a political football and isn't actually valuable. I think what's important is craft. That you can tell the difference between a bloviating opinion piece and something which involves quality, deep research, original research, and analysis. And essentially, we need more of that with a breadth of diversity, a breadth of viewpoints within it, and less of the just sort of hot takes.
So why should an organisation like the ABC not be bothered about balance? I mean, shouldn't you ensure that you have a balance of political interviews across a week, for example, or a month on your sort of key programs to ensure that there is the full sort of spectrum of opinions canvassed and policy positions canvassed?
Look, I suppose what I'd say is that, there's probably a fine line between viewpoint diversity and balance, but I think balance has become a political football, and it's become the argument that you use when you say, well, this particular story wasn't balanced because it was critical of the government or the opposition. And I think that the ABC's editorial position is balance across the platforms and across stories. And I think that's a fair enough position. But good journalism and good satire will often be markedly critical of one side because they deserve it.
Right.
And that's okay.
Yeah.
Why do you think it is that in this era, so many people are willing to place their trust in comedians, satirists, when they're not in journalists?
Obviously, that's a very concerning development, Hamish. There's a few things going on, and I mean, it's got to a point of where reality is following satire in the Ukraine. You've got the guy who pretends to be the president becoming the president. I think part of it.
Don't get any ideas, Julian.
Too many skeletons in my closet for public office, I'll tell you that. But I think that to some extent it's got to do with the wave of political satire, which has moved from just sort of sketches. It's become really research-driven. Mm-hmm. Think of the Gillies Report or Rubbery Figures, which I thought were great shows, and compare that to something like John Oliver or Jon Stewart. And a lot of that's got to do with technology. They've got much better at clipping everyone's sound bites and then using them against them over time. And I think that people really respond to that and develop trust in presenters who will kind of lead with the evidence.
So, Claire, do you think that there is some similarity here or some connection between people being willing to trust maybe an academic that isn't a journalist that writes a research-driven piece about an issue in the same way that they might about a comedian over someone like Damien saying, well, I'm just a sort of neutral reporter here and I'm going to canvass all of this and give it to you in a sort of maybe nuanced, but balanced fashion.
Yeah, and one thing we haven't really talked about much yet is YouTube. And you'll see on YouTube that channels with extremely low production value, where it's just a person in front of a webcam, can have millions and millions of subscribers and followers, and each video is seen by millions of people all over the world. And it's extremely low cost, and these people are having extreme, outsized influence compared to the production value. So I think this shift away from people placing trust in sort of slick, highly marketed, highly produced, pre-packaged products to more authentic, what they perceive to be, or more authentic and grassroots kind of products is happening all over the world and in all sorts of different areas.
So on that front, there's a very different threshold, isn't there, for somebody that has a YouTube channel or has a Twitter account with quite a few followers to get something out there than what there is for a broadcaster like the ABC or for a newspaper like the Sydney Morning Herald or the New York Times. And so you end up, don't you, with people then asking the question, well, why is it that I'm reading on Twitter this allegation about this politician, but I'm not seeing it in the mainstream media? Why is there this conspiracy of silence?
Yeah, well, organisations have a duty to fact-check claims, and obviously they can't just publish anything because they'll be sued for libel. But my prediction is that in the future we will turn to individual journalists who we trust. We will follow them on social media, and they may or may not be tied to any organisation, but because they will earn our trust because they make predictions that are credible and they won't spread falsehoods. So,
But that's a different kind of journalism, isn't it?
But that's where technology is leading us.
Sure, but you're talking about journalists making predictions that tend to be reliable. That's a very different thing to what I would consider journalism to be.
Well, making observations, reporting on real-world events, and doing so honestly and openly. I mean, that's journalism, and people do it now on Twitter who aren't tied to any organisations. There are independent journalists all over the world who aren't necessarily employed.
Yeah. I mean, Claire's right to point to media outlets that have a sort of their own code of self-regulation, often quite well developed. And the ABC certainly has that. The ABC has, I actually think, a really good set of editorial policies and polices them better than any other media organisation in the country. If there's a fault that the ABC has with its self-regulation, it's that it's too self-regulatory sometimes and gets caught up a little bit. But it is interesting that if this trend of journalists, or whatever you call them, are going to become trusted and popular, what is the framework around which their practice is going to be judged? This plays out often on YouTube. You see sort of spats between YouTubers in the sort of make-up blogging universe and stuff like that, where people make crazy allegations then have to retract them. It's getting worked out slowly, but it's because there's not a framework imposed by. I mean, YouTube's got user guidelines, but they're generally stepping back from the discussion. So I think that's going to be really interesting and hard to work out.
Damien, how do you think sort of traditional players in this area contend with this? I mean, I'm sure you would find this as well. Every dinner party you go to, every speech you go and give, there will be someone I'm sure today will ask, why isn't the mainstream media covering X story?
Right.
And probably every mainstream media organisation has looked into it. Maybe the substance is not there, or maybe there's just not enough to actually get it past the lawyers to get it into print or into broadcast. But there is a kind of cohort of people on Twitter that talk about it day in, day out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an enormous challenge, but I think what we've tried to do with the New York Times is open the doors a little bit more and explain, in some cases, well, here's what everyone's talking about. Here's why we don't believe it's true. And this is why you're not going to see that story. We do a lot more reader conversations than we used to, where we try to sort of open the door a bit. And I think there needs to be a lot of that. I mean, I do think what holds all this stuff together, whether it's comedy or individual journalists, is we live in a world where many people feel like the absurdity level has increased. And comedians have done a really great job of tapping into that sense of absurdity and reflecting it back to us to help us understand that world. And the mainstream media doesn't always do a great job of that. And so I do think that people are looking for alternative sources. But I also think that if you're a good, evolving media organization, then you're thinking about that too, and you're drawing that stuff in. I mean, the New York Times had a bit of an existential crisis at one point where, during the global financial crisis, we almost didn't make payroll. And I can't tell you how much that helped change the New York Times' culture inside. It opened the doors in ways that, frankly, the ABC, I don't think, has had a crisis like that.
Well, because funding's stable.
Yeah. So in some ways...
And even with conservative governments, I think the funding challenges that the private sector's had have been much worse than the ABC.
Right.
And I don't want to shock anyone, but inside the ABC, there probably is room for a little bit more efficiency in some places.
Yeah, maybe.
This conversation may be broadcast on the ABC, Julian, so be careful.
And it's shoddy editing like this.
Exactly.
Just to let you know, the text line has gone up on the screen. If you want to send a question in, do so now. Please put your name, and if the question is for one member of the panel, please put their name as well. I suspect this is going to come up a bit, so I will put this question to you now. Most people in this country get most of their news from media run by Murdoch or by Nine. How much of the polarisation of the so-called left and right can be seen as a deliberate campaign by these corporations to get the government laws and national culture that's most beneficial to them? Claire?
Yeah, Australia is terrible in terms of media diversity, and having so many publications owned by one person is definitely not good for the market. I don't know how to solve that problem other than promoting more niche publications with our patronage, seeking out talented journalists who are trustworthy and following them and listening to them, and either patronising them as individuals or patronising the company that they work for. I mean, we also have a duty as consumers and readers to reward people doing good work. And so the onus is on us as well as consumers.
Damien, coming from the United States, does it surprise you how little diversity there is in the Australian media in that regard?
I mean, I don't know if it surprises me. I mean, I do agree that a diversity of media and more voices, that's what every media ecosystem needs, but it's not just Australia that's the case. I mean, in the middle of the United States, there are, quote, news deserts in all kinds of places where people, don't have access to a whole lot of independent coverage about their own communities. And I think this is a problem for a lot of countries. I do think Murdoch and his particular brand of journalism is an interesting case study in what happens when you do have a clear agenda, and the relationship between not just the journalism, but the coziness with politics quite clearly that to me is more problematic. And I think that has created a bit of a culture, across Australia. It's not just here in Washington too, but this sense of, journalists go back and forth between being journalists and working in government, this revolving door between government and journalism that surprised me quite a bit. It cuts off my ability to hire a lot of those people because the New York Times doesn't do that. And so I think that there are a whole bunch of things that make the coverage of politics from a sort of ideological and mostly Murdoch-driven perspective kind of unique and surprising to me in Australia.
I think we've just got to get Rupert Murdoch a much more progressive girlfriend. Remember when he was married to Wendy Deng, and all the News Limited papers came out saying that they believed in climate change and that this needed to be done? And then that just dropped off the agenda a little bit afterwards when no longer there was that impetus from the top. Look, the influence of proprietors has always been a big factor in any media institution. The New York Times has been well served by a very rich family. Mm-hmm. The Guardian had sort of evolved that structure into a trust structure, and I think that there probably should be more of that.
Yeah.
But proprietors are always going to play a big role, and they probably should never play as big a role as Rupert Murdoch's been able to play in the Australian newspaper market.
Right.
I think that there's also a risk of over-exaggerating his influence as well. And
It's certainly a caricature. It's easy to say.
yeah, and you see some really conspiratorial kind of claims made about Rupert Murdoch's influence, and sure, his politics may match up with the editorial line on these newspapers, but that doesn't mean the editors are ringing him up every day seeking guidance on what to publish.
No, but
you don't need to.
influence works more subtly than that.
Yeah.
And I think there is a marked decrease in diversity of viewpoint within the Murdoch media empire.
I agree.
The Australian being the worst example of that.
I agree, but we do also have a tendency to scapegoat, and if you scapegoat Rupert Murdoch for everything that his papers publish and then don't see that his papers are actually selling the most within Australia, and readers, people are actually seeking out that information, then you risk missing the fact that there are many people living out in the suburbs who agree with the stuff that's being published.
Whereas I'd say you should scapegoat him but not miss the other stuff.
Yeah.
Could you argue that actually when it came to this past election, that actually the Murdoch press was more on the pulse of where the Australian public stood than
Yeah.
any other media outlets?
Not confidently though. I mean, they look, all the Murdoch front pages on election day weren't saying Morrison to get back.
But in terms of their sort of editorial agenda and the issues they covered and the way they talked about jobs over climate action, for example, did that ultimately reflect where the majority of the Australian public sat?
Well, probably, but I think that the problem seems to have been in the polling, and the news poll in particular, the one that was in the Murdoch papers. But
Julian, there's a question for you directly. What are the skeletons in your closet?
Good journalism right there.
My wife always said that if there's ever a public scandal, the thing to do would be to say, I always wondered whether it would be the sex or the drugs that got me first. So always admit to more. Look, I'll answer that by, and I did think it was funny with speaking of skeletons in the closet, with Al Jazeera's story about One Nation, where they said, we called for the full tapes in the first phase of the story, and the full tapes were the strip club and all that sort of stuff. Look, I've spent a long time taking the piss out of politicians, but in that time I've developed a respect for people who do those hard yards, and absolutely no desire to go into public life for the level of unreasonable scrutiny that you will inevitably get. So I'm not going to disclose all the skeletons now because that might compromise the sales of a memoir at some point, but it's going into public life is a really, really tough thing to do.
So there's a few questions broadly along this theme, but I'll read this one out. You each talked about hearing listener reader views through tweets, reader forums, etc. There's a huge risk that those people are not at all representative of the centre or general viewers. What do you do regularly to keep in touch with what the average person thinks? Damien?
Great question, and I totally agree. I think if you're only listening to the loud people on Twitter, you're not getting the general equal perspective. It's a bit of a cesspool these days. So one of the things that we've done, for example, before the election this year, is we went back to a whole bunch of people that we had met for other stories not related to politics. Mm-hmm. So we went to someone who we had talked to at the Denny Ute muster. We went to an Aboriginal elder that I met in South Australia regarding something totally different. We talked to a One Nation voter in Queensland for another story. So we went back to people. And I do think that's important to sort of go back to people that you've met along the way. I think for the New York Times, we have a small operation here, but we get out a lot. And we're not sort of trapped in the cities, I think. We do a lot of coverage outside of the major cities in Australia, so I think that helps us keep in touch. And our team is also small but diverse in a lot of ways too. We speak a bunch of different languages, backgrounds are very different. So I think that those are some of the things that we've tried to do. And I think this is how we try to do it around the world. At least this is how I think we should be trying to do it around the world, is to find that combination between local knowledge and expertise and fresh perspectives, and to be looking sort of toward the future of the country and not necessarily toward the sort of establishment. That the gaps, the established media in Australia doesn't always like us here at the New York Times. That's fine with us. We're trying to add something different, and so that's how we do it.
Julian, you surely don't talk to ordinary people.
Oh no,
outside
I'm in a bubble within a bubble. I'm completely out of touch. And the honest answer is I don't try at all. And it's never been part of my job to do that. And I think there are often too many people who worry too much about what the average person thinks. And that's very much coming from my background doing satire. Our job was to take the piss out of politics and the news of the week. And creatives often find that they are arguing with people who claim to represent the centre, but who just represent the keys to the treasury, and that it might be their job to care about what the average person thinks, but I don't think they do much research into it either. I think, for example, I think mainstream Australia is more diverse than commercial television is, and that's because the gatekeepers are so narrow, and they're sort of worrying about, well, they're representing an old-fashioned view of what Australia's like. Similarly with the checkout, all I decided to do was make a show that was about consumer affairs that was on the side of people who were getting ripped off. And I don't know whether that represents a general view, but I've been surprised often by how if you don't worry about what your audience thinks, but just do what you think's the right thing, you get a bigger audience.
Claire, I'm going to put this to you because it's loosely something you've talked about. The question is, people often use the term issues that matter to those outside the big cities as a shorthand for anti-immigration or nationalist sentiment. Do you agree, or are you referring to anything else when you use that term?
I think it's probably true to some degree that people living within cities, and particularly in the higher socioeconomic suburbs, the more where people are wealthier, you'll get more pro-immigration attitudes compared to places that are less wealthy. I don't think that's controversial. In terms of issues that are not covered, I think the issues that are important to people who are wealthy and rich and live comfortable, luxurious lives are just not the same as issues for people. They're just not the same as for people who don't live those luxurious lives. An issue like gender parity on corporate boards does not matter to people who I grew up with back in Port Adelaide in South Australia. No one is making it to be a CEO of a company. No one is going to be on an executive board. The fact that there isn't gender parity on corporate boards is meaningless.
But surely there are people in Adelaide that might work in a factory where the women do the jobs that are paid less than the men, and those decisions would be made by those boards where there's barely any women on the boards.
Well,
they're probably not worried about franking credits.
I'd like to see evidence of that. I really would. I mean,
what are there people working in factories?
I haven't worked in a factory, but I've worked in menial jobs, and I never got paid less.
Sure, but if you're clearly we know that there's more women in early childhood care. And this is a big issue. And they tend to be, owned by big conglomerates, that tend not to have enough women on the boards, and so that's why it's a pertinent
that would be an issue. That would be an issue. Wages for childcare workers should be talked about more. So wages, things that matter.
Sure, but just on the point of talking about women on boards, isn't that actually relevant to people that are, in those lower socioeconomic groups for those very reasons?
I don't think so. I don't think it's
front of mind. I think Claire's right about that it's not. If you're writing about the corporate boards more than you're writing about the wages, then that reveals.
So is it the failure of the media
there's a tendency among elites to
What
care about diversity for the top echelons of society, whereas it just doesn't matter when you're not already at that top echelon of society.
So is it a failure then not to consider those issues about, as you describe it, the elites, but the people at the board level in the context of why that matters to someone that's working for the company ultimately?
If you are on a minimum wage job you don't you don't care about who's on the board of your company. It's meaningless. It doesn't, unless someone explains to you just how exactly the board composition will impact your wages, it's meaningless, it's irrelevant.
So Julian, do you think that there are other issues other than anti-immigration or white nationalist sentiment that we're talking about when we talk about issues that matter outside the big cities?
Well, I mean, go back to my earlier comment. I'm not convinced that there are sort of massive swathes of issues that are being ignored, actually. I think that there's only so many minutes in a program or pages in a newspaper, and organisations try to cover the range of issues. But I'm not, I suppose, obviously I wouldn't be aware of the issues that aren't being covered, but no, I don't think that's a big problem. And I think that there is anti-immigration sentiment, but there's also social dislocation, the effects of, basically the decline of a certain type of job, which is having really bad social impacts in places other than the inner cities. And that's true, but that's not something that the elites aren't aware of.
I think too, I also think that, and there's research to sort of support this, people who study populism, a lot of the concern in some of these communities, and you see this in America with Trump too, it's more about focusing on what those urban people are telling us what to do, or there's this sense of divide where instead of focusing on, say, like if you're a Trump voter, the Trump voters in my family, they'd rather talk about what the left is doing, what those urban elites are doing to Trump, than they want to talk about any actual policy for Trump. And so these divides, and they've gotten much worse in Australia as Australia's gotten richer. And so, these are divides that are going to continue to shape politics. And I don't think it's just about an issue like immigration. A lot of it's just about a visceral sense of who I am, and they don't get me.
It's a lot of it is a feeling that people who are proud to live in a bubble or a bubble within a bubble feel superior.
Right.
And it's a feeling that it's almost like class reinvented. It's almost like class difference expressed through moral issues.
And culture.
If you're not on board with all of the diversity sentiments, inclusivity sentiments, if you're not on board with climate change, if you're not on board being pro-immigration, then you're of lower class, and you're not in the... You're an inferior person. I think that's the feeling that people get.
And I think that all of society, they're going to have to deal with this. Like the people on the left who want these policies need to figure out a way how to connect with people who feel like they're just being talked down to.
Exactly.
We're running out of time. One more question. It's a pretty simple one. It's about your own media habits. What do you wake up in the morning and look at? Where do you get your news from, Claire?
Well, I go to my trusted individuals on Twitter.
Who are they?
I follow people like Steven Pinker, people who I respect as truthful, honest scientists. They're often scientists, and contrarians. So I have a small group of academics who I follow, and they will have interesting articles from all different publications. People like Steven Pinker, Sam Harris, I try and get a bit of diversity. I have a few different lists of left-wing publications and then right-wing, and I follow quite a lot of people who say nasty things about me and my publication, but sometimes they actually have a good point. And
don't do it first thing in the morning. We've got to wrap this up pretty quickly, but Damien, where do you go first thing?
I go to the New York Times, but I'll tell you what I do less and less of is go to Twitter.
Okay, and Julian?
I don't read newspapers or consume as much mainstream media anymore, but I'm going to end this with a shameless plug. Nothing makes me happier than to turn on Radio National Breakfast in the morning and to hear you on it, because I think Radio National Breakfast is fantastic, and AM and PM, but actually not consuming as much news media is quite fun. It's good. Life's not as bad when you don't.
Yeah.
It's okay. Sorry.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, Julian Morrow, Claire Lehmann and Damien Cave. Would you please put your hands together?
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm doing less media too.
Hello, everybody. This time I'm right. We do have a